Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for literature and publications for Being Libertarian LLC, which includes BeingLibertarian.com, Think-Liberty.com, RationalStandard.com, and of course, Champion Books, which does have its inaugural book out, Igniting Liberty, Voices for Freedom Around the World. You've heard me talk about the book for several weeks now. I'm getting pretty close to stopping myself from talking about it, but it is that good of a book, and I do definitely recommend that you get out there and get a copy if you haven't already. You can follow us on all forms of social media. You can follow myself specifically by searching Killian Hobbs Author on Facebook there. And you can listen to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, including the podcast, The Curious Task, to which I do have the host on. Now, last episode, I didn't have, they didn't have the first episode out just yet when I had Vinny on here before. Actually, Vinny, say hi again.
Hey, buddy. How you doing? Thanks for having me again. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you on. You're actually my first repeat guest.
Oh, really?
Big times, big times.
Yeah, look out, everybody else. Suck it. Take that.
All the other guests are going to listen to this episode and hear you say that, and you're just going to get shit on for like 2 weeks straight, and it's going to be funny.
I don't give a shit.
Anyways, I was saying, Vinny does have his new podcast out, The Curious Task. If you haven't had the chance to listen to any of the episodes yet, please do. They're great. And I'm not just saying that to placate my guest here.
No, thanks. Appreciate it.
For the episode today, we are continuing the series of deep diving in on key philosophers, economists, thinkers, just general minds, and diving into some of the things they stood for, some of the things that they talked about, and just going through their ideologies. For today, the reason I've got Vinny on here is so that we can discuss Hayek. Now, for anyone that follows the main Think Liberty podcast, I'm sure you've heard Vinny talk about Hayek in depth. However, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach and go into some of the peculiarities of the man himself and the way that he presented things. So the things that made Hayek unique in comparison to other general libertarian thinkers. So Vinny, what would you say is probably the biggest thing that set Hayek apart from a lot of the other primary libertarian thinkers?
I think the thing that set him apart, or that I noticed set him apart, is he came at things in a different way. Instead of coming at things through like a self-ownership, property rights, kind of foundation, natural rights, all that kind of stuff, he came at it from a completely different way. I always feel like I'm going to say this wrong. Epistemological. Did I say it right? Is that the right way to say it?
You got it right.
Okay, nice.
Or at least good enough that they know what you're talking about.
Killer, bro. Yeah. Yeah, he looks at things like that a lot differently. And instead of just the foundations, I found I was able to have a little bit more confidence in, and the stuff that he talks about is a little different too, right? Like, and this isn't to discount his work, but I feel like these two always get brought up too, and I hate to do that. I'm not trying to compare the two against each other. It's just like they're the two biggest from the Institute, right? But like, so Rothbard, aside from his historical stuff, his kind of stuff is really like, well, what if kind of work, right? Like what if this happened, or what if that happened, or what if we got there, what would this look like? And Hayek's stuff is more like, what do you do right now? And I found that really interesting about his work as well.
Yeah, very, you could almost call it consequentialist. I mean, he did get into some of the backbone idea stuff, but a lot of it was really framed around we can have these great ideas, but what's reality going to look like? Let's work from there. I'd say, right. Obviously, it's one of his more famous works, but that's one of the things I always liked in his book, Road to Serfdom, was the fact that, for me, I always found that he was one of the few libertarian writers that really worked from a place of good faith. A lot of the time with a lot of different libertarian writers, whenever they're talking about people who support the state or support socialism or support communism or any of these other quote unquote, evils, they always go immediately into some form of an attack mode. And not just attacking the ideology, but they attack the people that are willing to support the ideology, claiming some sort of moral or intellectual deficiency in those people for even having the audacity to think that any of those ideas could work. Hayek took a different approach with that and instead said, okay, listen, we know you're coming from a good place. We know you think that this could work. We know that you want this to work because you don't understand how the markets of competition make things better for people. You'd rather there not be a competition because a competition means people lose. So instead, you're trying to come up with a system where that doesn't happen. But here's how that plays out, and here's why you need to abandon that idea so that we can have a better society. We get what you're trying to do, and I don't fault you for it, but we know where this goes. Please stop. And I found that refreshing, like reading him, especially reading him after having read other libertarian writers, just coming across that and saying, good. Someone who doesn't start off by saying that you are a violator of rights and morally a bastard,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. It's hey, first and foremost, socialists are immoral pieces of shit, and I hope they burn in hell. Anyway,
Yeah, exactly.
Chapter 1.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's a great foot to start off on when you're trying to explain to people why their thinking is wrong. So, you know, from that kind of argumentation style, that's something that I really appreciated in a lot of his work, because that same kind of good faith approach stuck through even when he was discussing things that he was vehemently against. He still tried to play it from the angle of, I see what you're saying. I see what you're trying to say. Let me spell out what I see wrong with what you're saying.
Yeah, he was always real level-headed. And another thing I really liked about his work, too, is that he was always pretty humble. You know, there's multiple spots in a lot of his work where he'll either admit to, you know, where he changed his mind on something, or he'll admit, you know, this might not be something that I have full understanding of, and I very well may be wrong, as I've been wrong on other things before. And that like you said, with the kind of rhetoric that's behind a lot of this other work that can go around, it's nice to read that kind of approach as a change of pace.
And what was nice with it was that it didn't come with the sense of being wishy-washy. Because sometimes, you know, when just philosophers in general, when they get out into the weeds and they start talking about a whole bunch of like completely out of their comfort zone ideas, and they start using a lot of maybe, possibly, kind of, sort of type terminology.
Right.
When they start doing that, they don't show that they're not speaking from a place of understanding. They say, you know, I think it could work out like this, and I'm right on all the other stuff, so maybe I'm right here too. But don't question that. Let's move on. Whereas I actually took the approach of saying, this is what I got wrong before. Here's how I'm going to correct it, and here's how it fits into what I think still. I don't know about this. I think based on evidence, it could work out like this, but I'm not actually going to put my name on that because I'm not egotistical enough to do that.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've noticed this, but for the listeners that might not be as familiar, there's a lot of people in this whole kind of arena of thought that have kind of like gone at it. And I mean, shit. And you see it online too with people all the time. It's kind of everywhere, right? Like people, for a lot of people, Hayek is like everyone's favorite philosopher to hate. And some of the reasons I guess are warranted, right? But
we'll get into those a little later.
But just to kind of build off of what you were saying, though, some of the stuff that people decide to pick are like to like pick at are things that he had discussed, were things that he believed early on, and then completely changed on it near the end of his career. Right? Like with economics, right? Like he used to be he used to talk about equilibrium and stuff like that, and just the more he got into his ideas of spontaneous order and things of that nature, the more he kind of moved away from this idea of economic equilibrium. And you know, you can read all about this if you pay attention to his work, how he moves on, and he basically, near the end there, he's just, you can read him as saying like, I was probably wrong about equilibrium. Like this whole thing, it seems to work a lot differently than I had thought it did. And then people will go out and they'll levy attacks based on the things he said, and before he corrected himself. And I always felt like that was really dishonest to take something someone said that they later came around on and they admitted they were wrong about, and you just kind of want to reach back to the beginning, step over the part where they admitted that they were wrong about it and hold up, look at this, look what you believed in, dummy. I feel like that's kind of low.
Yeah. I mean, the worst part with that, again, like you said, it's disingenuous. But it also, it misses the point of the development of a thinker. Like one of the things with Hayek, and you kind of touched on it there, Hayek's one of the type of thinkers or the type of philosophers, economists, whatever realm you want to put him in for all the topics he touched on. He's one of those people that you really have to read his work in chronological order, because he actually will admit throughout his work that he gets things wrong and he needs to progress. It's not to say that you need to read absolutely everything in his works, but when you're reading through his work, it's important to remember, okay, this one came out in this stage of his career. This one came out in this stage of his career. And really just keeping that in mind with him. Some of the other people, their ideas stayed pretty much static from start to finish in their career. You could pick up any book off of their catalog and you've got an idea of what they were talking about, and it didn't really change. Might have added a few layers here and there, but it didn't really evolve in the true sense.
That's a good point.
With Hayek, he changed his mind a lot, so you had to keep that in mind when you're reading him. Yeah.
Like you're not going to get. Well, I guess that's not necessarily true. I was going to say you're not going to get. I can't believe I was about to say that and didn't even realize what I was saying. I was like, you're not going to get a different young Rothbard than you will an old Rothbard. But it's like, well, young Rothbard probably didn't want to start a political movement with David Duke either. So
but based on his writing, though, like based on his written works, his ideas didn't evolve too far outside of what he was originally preaching. He just kind of started walking down the logical conclusions of his original thoughts.
Not to get too into Rothbard, but I feel like it's my belief that at the end of it, right, like he was just kind of like half fuck it tour, right? When you get old enough and you're just on that fuck it tour. You just don't care anymore. I think he was like half there and half like, man, I gotta try something. I gotta try something big. And I think to him, that was his something big. He just, half of him didn't care and half of him was like, well, fuck it. Let's just see if this works.
Let's see how this plays out.
Yeah. Anyhow.
Going into it though, speaking of changing of minds here, what would you say are some of Hayek's misses? I know that's a painful question for you.
No. I mean, look, it's totally fair. No one's perfect. The Constitution of Liberty has got some pretty rough stuff in it. As I understand, Keynes had written to Hayek basically saying like, okay, so what, where does it stop? What is it? Like, are you an anarchist? What's the deal? What does your society look like? And he never really responded. He just wrote the Constitution of Liberty. And that was kind of his response, I think. So like the first portion of that was pretty great. And then the second isn't, he advocates for like the draft in there, or tries to make a case of why it would be justified. He, is sympathetic to a form of UBI in there. He talks about some welfare stuff that I'm sure the anarchists from the Mises Institute would be quick to scoff at, and I think that's fair. Mises himself, I think, was quoted as saying that the Constitution of Liberty, for the most part, was a great book, but there was kind of like the same thing I'm saying, right? There's some stuff in there he felt that was really terrible, but I think Mises was quoted as saying something like the bad wasn't nearly enough to make it a bad work, right? He said it was still a great work, regardless. And there was much more good than there was bad, but there was some bad takes in there. And I essentially feel the same way about kind of Hayek stuff in a whole. Where I appreciate Hayek the most was the way he thought and the way he worked, right? Instead of working in a way like, so if you read like For a New Liberty, that's a lot different than like a fatal conceit. Like For a New Liberty, it really sets things up in a super specific way. Like, this is how this could work. This is how this could work. This is how this could work. Rothbard was really great at that, taking these like hypotheticals, and he had this brilliant way of like really kind of thinking of stuff that you didn't even think people were capable of thinking of in terms of solutions. And the way that Rothbard did that, it taught you how to think in a different way. Well, Hayek, he does the same thing, but the foundations that he lays, I think, are a little different, and they lead you to think a little bit differently. So it's similar to like how Rothbard would set up his stuff, but he has his own little Hayek spin on it. And he sets up his different kind of frameworks together to make like what is the sum of his philosophy. But yeah, sorry, getting off track. But back on point there. It really is the times where he's quick to excuse the state. I'm sympathetic to the positions he had with consumer protection, and I understand those. I just think that there's a lot of instances like you're talking about defending the draft and stuff like that I just can't get on board with.
Speaking of the way that he thinks and kind of the way that he presents things, would you be able to elaborate or maybe cover a little bit of exactly what his thinking on spontaneous order was?
Yeah. So spontaneous order, it is a part of a two-part basis of theory. So spontaneous order goes with social evolution. And this is basically the idea that, so cultural social evolution is like this kind of thing that, are you familiar with neural networks? Have you heard that before?
Yep.
Yeah. So he was kind of on that hype, right? Like, I think Hayek was a determinist for sure. He was also kind of had this like social Darwinism, which, we can go into. A lot of people like to give it like a boogeyman type of name. But it's just this idea that, people evolve from tradition, and it's carried on over the years, and that's kind of how people get where they get. And there's also spontaneous order as well, that goes along with that. So it's that these people, us human beings, we evolve and through tradition and history and all these things, and we from adhering to rules, right? Like, he was really big on rules. Rules are just kind of part of our day-to-day lives, and they influence us. And a lot of times, like what Hayek would say is a lot of this stuff is you're not even aware of when it's influencing you and how it's influencing you. We don't even have the knowledge to completely understand how it works, but we're just all kind of together in this evolutionary process. And then the spontaneous order is kind of what comes along with it, which is just like, it's an order. Like I was saying, he's really big on rules, right? So it's still like an order, but it's a spontaneous order, as opposed to like a centrally planned order. And it starts at a local area instead of, it's bottom up instead of top down.
Mm-hmm. It's basically, it's kind of the way that humans just naturally fall into rules and rhythms and patterns and things like that, but it's expressed in the macro. And that's, I think, it's taking a concept that when you're looking at it on a small scale or individual scale, almost everyone and their mother would say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's exactly how it works out. But he actually had the foresight to say, okay, well, let's look at the entirety of humanity, and oh, look, it still holds.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to put out an episode somewhat soon on these two ideas, his two-part idea on spontaneous order and social evolution. But it's very interesting when you think about it, because to reflect it back to like the road to serfdom, a lot of what the road to serfdom was about, aside from his kind of takedowns, on socialism and him pointing out some of the flaws with those systems, a lot of it is about working to push things into a different direction. right? Like if you read like all the stuff before the book that he's put out there, and like it's really about changing the direction, trying to change the flow, trying to change the mental state, trying to change the direction that politics are going in.
Mm-hmm.
And when you kind of observe that and then put it next to the social evolution and the spontaneous order, things really start to kind of make a little more sense. You know, he was really trying to push for an organic movement, an organic change. He felt that was the only way to do it, is you have to be aware of the social evolution and play your part in influencing it to a point where it goes in the direction. Obviously, he's looking at it as it's either going to go, you know, in a direction of like control and socialism, the road to serfdom, or freedom. And I always thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a great take on there. And I find, you know, we've talked a little bit about his real world applications and kind of the consequentialist almost view that he had on a few things. One of the most interesting things I found just in the history of Hayek himself, you know, setting aside the works themselves, but the history of him, was the way that his work, Road to Serfdom, ended up in a long, convoluted way involving Reader's Digest and a chance meeting and a couple things like that, led to the foundation of a lot of the IEFs that we have around the world. So a lot of the like international economic foundations that push for economic freedom and everything else like that, they all started from the base of trying to avoid the road to serfdom that was painted in that same book. It's an interesting history for anyone that has it there. It takes a little bit to go through and to actually explain the amount of organizations. I think there's about 100 of them that are active globally that publish works and host seminars and do all these other things to push the idea of free market economics around the world. And not just around the Western world, I mean literally around the world. I'm not going to touch into all that here, of course, just because there's only so much time in an episode, and I'm not going to have it like the last time I had Vinny on where we went on for an hour and a half here. I probably could on Hayek. But definitely interesting history to look into on that front. And also keep an eye out for the episode on the Curious Task about spontaneous order and social evolutionary rights, because that's definitely going to be something that's interesting to listen to there. I guess one other thing I really want to dive into with you here, Vinny, would be if there was a major, I guess, application to his ideas. I know a lot of people, when they look at Hayek, they look at either his view on rights or his view on coercion or the separation between him and Rothbard or some of the broad scale political view stuff. But he also had a lot of interesting views on money policy. Do you want to go through some of his money policy stuff with us here?
Yeah, sure. He was a really fantastic economist. Like even the people that like even Hoppe, who dislikes him, will give him his due respect as an economist. Very good stuff there. But what's really interesting is there's a video out there on YouTube where he basically like predicts crypto. And I always found that really interesting. So if you listen to him talking about money, he's just like, his way of seeing it was like he wanted to see a market for money. Private currencies could exist. And then he went a little bit into like digital private currencies. It's insane how close he got, like in the 80s, to actually talking about cryptocurrency before it even existed. It's pretty crazy. But I always thought that was really, really interesting. I mean, to get into his stuff in economics, like in a broad sense, would be far more time than we have here. But I did think it was interesting that he touched on the whole digital private currencies thing before people knew that digital private currencies were going to be what they are.
That's another thing that I've always liked with a lot of Hayek's work, is that the older the work gets, the more fitting it seems to become.
It holds up. That's how you know he was getting some things right.
Yeah, definitely.
You go back Like that emergencies quote, man, that thing's always popping up. There's a lot of stuff he said that's it rings true. I mean, there's a reason that that the road to serfdom, like every 30 years, it like runs back and just like it just goes nuts. Not every 30 years. It's only been out. No, maybe. Yeah, no, it's been, I was thinking of the Fatal Conceit release date. Yeah, but it has these runs, man, where it'll come up and boom, it'll just go a bestseller again. I think there's a reason for that.
Mm-hmm. So I think, I guess just to close everything off here, just because we're getting a little close on time here, I'd say one of the last things I kind of want to touch on here when it comes to Hayek, of course, would be a little essay that he did, or not a little essay, I should say, but a little side work that he had. It wasn't really of the same length as most of his other stuff, but he had a side work about the role of intellectuals. Now, Hayek always liked to refer to what he called the intellectual class as the secondhand dealer of ideas. So these are the people that they're not really thinking up the new things in the truest sense, or they're not necessarily the ones developing these plans or developing these concepts, but instead they're the people that they're simply regurgitating some of the information. And it's why you end up with the kind of net of things that you see in academia. You wouldn't have some of the socialist prevalences that you see in academia that even in his time they were seeing in academic circles. It wouldn't have taken place if it weren't for people that were these secondhand dealers of ideas. How familiar are you with his view on intellectuals there, Vinny?
Fairly familiar with it. I always, since we're on the topic of intellectuals, I always thought, to anyone not familiar, his book, The Fatal Conceit, it's my favorite book that he wrote. Maybe it doesn't have as much substance as the other stuff, but I really like The Fatal Conceit because it's the one book where like all of his stuff just kind of comes in together. Like, Hayek was huge on price theory. He was huge on spontaneous order, on social evolution, on what language does to a society, and this idea he called the fatal conceit. So you talk about intellectuals, he talked a lot about what you had just mentioned. And also his thing is he felt like intellectuals are always the ones that support central planning so much because they fall for what he called the fatal conceit. And that's being so intelligent that you trick yourself into thinking that you're smart enough to plan for everybody else. And I always thought that was really kind of like a brilliant and elegant way to really present how someone so intelligent can still have a shortcoming. Because in my opinion, that observance is very fair. It's clearly very accurate. And he goes after people like Einstein and Ayn Rand, Ayn Rand,
yeah,
and others, right? Who maybe tried to go a little harder than he thought was fair. And I thought that was another really interesting take on intellectuals as well. So very intelligent, so intelligent that they fall for the worst trick they could.
Yep. Self-defeating hubris.
Yeah. And another interesting thing too, before we go, we talked about like how his stuff is different because it's in the real world. It's important, right, to note, like, I believe it's Margaret Thatcher that basically brought the constitutional liberty like everywhere, like carried it in her purse. He was talking to world leaders, and I think that's a difference that should be recognized. He wasn't just kind of writing theoretical stuff and kind of stretching his intellect there, which that's not to discount that. I'm not discounting that at all, but it's just a completely different place to write. Mm-hmm. And it's a completely different work to do. He, like I said, he was talking to world leaders. He knew he was speaking to world leaders. And anyone listening, go look up the Mount Pelerin sessions. Hayek single-handedly planned these things where they got people together. It was Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, Ludwig von Mises, Rothbard, just all of these thinkers, everybody, and just to get them together to figure out, like, what can they do to change that tide? What can they do to push politics in that different direction? What can they do to fight against this issue? And I think that once you look hard enough into all this stuff that he's done, it's quite impressive.
Yeah, I mean, whether you completely agree with his takes or not, if it's one thing that can be appreciated of him, especially in libertarian circles, it has to be the doer mentality that he had. The fact that he wasn't just looking to explore an ideology, he was looking to get something done with what he was saying. And I think that, I think libertarianism in general would be far more prevalent if more libertarian thinkers had that mentality. I mean, we look back at the history of the British Parliament. There are tons of pro-liberty philosophers who were also statesmen because they understood the importance of actually applying these ideas rather than simply talking about their existence. And I think that was something that Hayek nailed, was the fact that we can talk about, Ancapistan until we're blue in the face, and that sounds great. But unless we're doing something that's going to get us there, it's just intellectual exercise and something interesting. Or, we're leaving instruction manuals for people who might actually do the work if we ever happen to inspire someone to do it.
Right. Yeah, and that's not to discount the other stuff. To be clear, I think that it takes both, right? I think that it takes the theoretical stuff, which is a lot more, I hate this term, but I think it's best understood here, pure, right? It's like a lot more adhering to principles. And then you've got the kind of the more pragmatic and practice stuff. And I think both of them need to be there. I think that the more pure approach is a good reminder of when a pragmatic approach may be sacrificing too much. And I think that it helps keep a grounding there. So I think that there's definitely room for both, more so than people give it credit for. But to your point, I do think that the practical stuff possibly shows up a little less than it should, in complement with the theoretical stuff.
It's almost a tad reminiscent of Plato's World of Forms a little bit. Just a little.
Yeah.
Damn it, exactly.
I hate when I do that.
Nothing worse than referencing the Greeks.
I'm
going to get hate now from like 3 Greek people who happen to listen to this.
I've been organizing my kitchen for months. Sorry, that wasn't nice.
Oof. All right.
They drew. Did you hear about that? They drew dicks on everything in Europe.
Yeah.
They draw a bunch of dicks on everything. I can appreciate that.
Me too. It showcases that even though we have social evolution, some things don't change.
That's right. So sometimes you just got to draw dick.
Some things are just ingrained. It's how we roll.
Yeah.
So anyway, Vinny, thank you very much for coming on. It was a pleasure talking to you as always, especially when we get to talk about some of the meat and potatoes to a great thinker like Hayek. The series will continue into the next week. I got a special guest on for that one as well. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, you can follow us on all forms of social media. You can follow me directly at Killian Hobbs Author on Facebook there. People have been telling me I need to get a Twitter, but I'm still not interested. So that's not happening anytime soon. Might in the future, but not right now. You can listen to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Especially keep out an ear for The Curious Task in the next episode that comes up on there. And as always, sorry?
I said, that's right, The Curious Task. Totally.
That's right, The Curious Task. Also, since somebody missed it when we said this in the last episode that I had Vinny on here for, Vinny, you have to say it now, right? Fuck
yeah, Hayek. That's right.
It was, I guess you could call it a blooper, but we had about a 5-minute laughing fit where we just went into that for some reason. I have no idea why at this point. I can't even remember. But
no, it was because you were like "F you, Hayek," and I was like "Fuck yeah, Hayek."
Yeah.
Fucking yeah. And it's philosophy jokes. I'm still laughing about Occam's Libertarian. So.
Oh, we are glorious, glorious nerds, and it's amazing.
I know. Sometimes these jokes are all we have.
Yeah, sometimes it just works.
Yeah, keeping us.
But anyway, again, thank you for being on. And as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.